In the context of MMOs, the answer entirely depends on whether the end-user agreement varies the position of the copyright legislation. Now, it can get very complex, and frankly it's beyond the time frame we have today. Copyright lawyers could roll around in the mud in apparent ecstasy for days trying to work on these issues. Our Act has become a complex hive of exceptions and exceptions to exceptions. But that said, there is an overarching principle of balance. A balance which is, on the one hand, the interests of individuals and businesses to create and commercialise, who generally wish to maximise the economic life and integrity of their work, and on the other hand, that of society. The Copyright Act tends to do this by granting a series of exclusive rights. It's for a limited period of time, and then there are a series of exceptions that eat away at that for the benefit of society and others. Now, achieving that balance is no easy task. The competing interests are very, very wide. It's intensely political. In the recent free trade agreements with America, much of that deal was done behind closed doors between large American media companies, their Australian subsidiaries, and our government. It wasn't until the backbone of that was negotiated before it was really made a public Australian issue. Serious political and very moneyed up issues in there. It didn't used to be that way. Our first bit of copyright was the Statute of Anne in 1710. There it is. I'm very fond of this. It was like 3 pages long. It was introduced because of a great fear of printing presses, because publishers and authors at that time were the big copyright owners. And the wording was fantastic. It's stuff like, whereas printers, booksellers and other persons have of late frequently taken the liberty of printing, reprinting and publishing, or causing to be printed, reprinted and publishing books and other writings without the consent of the authors and proprietors of such books and writings, to their very great detriment and too often to the ruin of them and their families. You don't see that kind of stuff anymore. So, notwithstanding some attacks, Copyright Act works pretty well, but it's a very complex balance of issues and scenarios to consider. There it is. So, let me just give you a brief taste of the complexity before I move on. Let's take a game sequence like Halo 3. The Copyright Act would classify that sequence as a film, but also as a dramatic work, and the underlying program would in fact be considered a literary work. So there's 3 different copyrights that can exist in there. Just taking the film one. The Act says that the owner of the film is the maker of the film. It goes on to say that the making of the film means doing all things necessary for the production of the first copy of the film. So in the traditional sense, the maker is the producer. Then you start thinking, well, how does this actually tie in with the recorded game sequence of Halo 3? The maker of the film is the person who's made the arrangements necessary for the making of the film. Follows that the film, therefore, is not made actually during the filming of the processing, when the production arrangements are actually carried out. So, is it the developer? Is it the developer because they put the arrangements in place, arguably? But what about the players? They insert the disc and play the game, record it. Is the developer then really just like the company that made the camera on Mel Gibson's Apocalypto set? On the other hand, the players could be directors. And directors get express acknowledgement of the Copyright Act. Complex issues. For the purpose of today, it is really likely in user-generated content, particularly like this, that the player could well have some rights. So let's keep this bit really simple. Players are likely to own content, and the reality is that the user agreement is key, and it needs to be given these complexities. Now, before we turn to the notion of who should own player content, I really really just want to let you kind of think about that. But let me just give a couple of quick perspectives. On the one side, game developers invest an enormous amount of time, money and effort in developing the game. Before the first game is sold, many millions of dollars, of course, and that money is at risk. From the developer's perspective, then owning as much as they can is a really attractive proposition. They need it to help recoup. On the other side, the developer needs to sell the game to players, and if the game doesn't seem fair, it won't sell as much. The player will, of course, argue that they spend a lot of time and labour. If you think about the collective number of players and how much time they all spend on it, it's going to be more than the developers spend. So they spend a lot of time, and some instances money, in developing their content, and in some cases the creations have been entirely conceptualised, scripted, animated, directed and invented by the user. So especially in the later case, there's a compelling argument there should be some rights for the users. Microsoft Word, for example, is the tool by which you create all your documents, and I wrote this speech. Microsoft's not going to own that. Whatever the theory is that's applied, whenever there's a substantial amount of time, energy or money expended, people have an expectation of ownership, or at least an interest of some description. And this was exemplified in the most grisly fashion when a man lent his friend his virtual sword. The friend sold it. The original owner of the sword reported what he considered to be an illegal activity. When the authorities didn't do anything about it, went round to the user's house, killed him. That happened in the real world. And if you've got that level of intensity of expectation, my view is that you should start thinking about, facilitating other resolutions. So let's start having a look at some of the user agreements. Now, from an intellectual property perspective, there are two main camps. Those who let players own IP, such as Linden Lab and Second Life, and those who don't, such as Sony and EverQuest. Both the games allow players to create objects within the game and also import content. So let's start with EverQuest. That's just some liminal advertising there. EverQuest 2 is owned by Sony, and they take an approach seeking to own or at least have extensive rights in just about everything. Now, the relevant part of the user agreement is like this. So they say they retain pretty much everything. Goes on to say that the player acknowledges that they don't have any rights. So you'll note that it specifically mentions that the player doesn't have any rights in characters. Those characters that they spend so much time working on, investing time in, and which have a real world value. The sale of in-game objects or virtual property or real currency has been a long-running concern to Sony. And so notwithstanding some of the contractual provisions that they used to have prohibiting such trade, there was still a thriving business in it, selling characters and virtual assets. The sales were particularly attractive to those who didn't have enough time to build up their game experience. And when Sony saw this happening, they thought it was illegal, they thought it was traversing their rights inappropriately. And so in 2001, now an eon ago in games time, Sony sought to enforce its end-user agreements and got eBay to assist, banning all those sales. They thought, fantastic, we've done it. But of course what happened is it just forced all the sellers from eBay onto another site. And at that point, Sony was faced with, well, do we go chasing our tails looking for each subsequent site that happens, or do we reconsider it? And really, they realised their market error. They could be making money and controlling these trades. So they set up Station Exchange, which was very prescriptive. It told people exactly how they could operate. And so their license agreement said, you can't do anything with anything except by Station Exchange. So when players wanted to have their intellectual property rights and content, Sony started making some concessions. So there's the exception that exists.